The most dangerous kind of pride is not arrogance. It is intelligence. That sounds backwards, doesn't it? We are taught to believe that intelligence protects us from mistakes. That the sharper your mind is, the harder you are to deceive. But what if the opposite is sometimes true? What if intelligence doesn't eliminate self-deception? What if it makes self-deception more sophisticated? That is the mystery hidden inside Elizabeth Bennet. Most readers remember her as one of literature's smartest observers. She is quick, perceptive, independent, and unusually skilled at reading the people around her. In a world driven by appearances, social expectations, and carefully managed reputations, she seems to possess a rare advantage. She sees through pretension. She notices contradictions. She questions what others blindly accept. And that is exactly why she is so fascinating. Because the central question surrounding Elizabeth is not whether she is intelligent. The question is whether intelligence alone can be trusted. There is a strange paradox buried deep within human nature. The more capable we become at analyzing other people, the less likely we are to examine our own assumptions. We become excellent critics and terrible witnesses of ourselves. Think about that for a moment. The people most vulnerable to manipulation are not always the least informed. Sometimes they are the people who feel most confident in their ability to judge. Not because they lack evidence, but because they stop questioning the lens through which they interpret that evidence. And that is where Elizabeth becomes something much larger than a literary character. She becomes a mirror. A mirror that reflects one of the most uncomfortable truths about the human mind. The greatest blind spot is often the one that believes it has no blind spots. Notice the contradiction. Ignorant people are often forced to doubt themselves because reality keeps exposing their mistakes. Intelligent people face a different danger. Their successes create confidence. Their confidence creates certainty. And certainty can quietly transform into a prison. A prison with invisible walls. Because once we become convinced that our judgment is reliable, we begin collecting proof that supports what we already believe. We notice confirming evidence. We ignore conflicting evidence. We mistake confidence for accuracy. Modern psychology has names for these patterns. Jane Austen did not need them. She understood the mechanism long before the terminology existed. What makes Elizabeth remarkable is not that she represents intelligence. It is that she represents the limits of intelligence. And that distinction changes everything. Because this is not ultimately a story about social status. It is not even primarily a story about romance. Beneath those layers lies a deeper investigation into perception itself. How do we know that what we believe is true? How much of our judgment is observation, and how much is desire? How often are we seeing reality, and how often are we seeing a version of reality that confirms what we already want to think? Imagine a person standing in front of a mirror that perfectly reflects everyone else in the room, but never reflects the person looking into it. That image may be the most important memory fragment in this entire discussion. Because that mirror is not a piece of glass. It is the human mind. And Elizabeth Bennet may be one of literature's most elegant demonstrations of what happens when a brilliant observer becomes trapped inside her own certainty. But that leads to an even larger question. If someone as intelligent as Elizabeth can mistake confidence for truth, then what does that say about the rest of us? If the human mind is a mirror with a blind spot, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What creates that blind spot in the first place? Most people assume self-deception begins with ignorance. We imagine that people fool themselves because they lack information, lack experience, or lack intelligence. But the deeper you look, the stranger the pattern becomes. Human beings rarely deceive themselves because they know too little. More often, they deceive themselves because they need certain things to be true. That is where Elizabeth's role becomes far more significant than that of a clever observer navigating a social world. She becomes a case study in a hidden conflict that exists inside almost every intelligent person. The conflict between perception and identity. Because the moment a belief becomes connected to our sense of self, objectivity begins to disappear. Think about how this works in everyday life. A person can change an opinion. A person can abandon an argument. But changing an identity is much harder. And once intelligence becomes part of someone's identity, a subtle danger emerges. The goal quietly shifts. Instead of seeking truth, the mind begins protecting the image of being right. Notice the contradiction. The smartest people often see themselves as independent thinkers. Yet that very self-image can become another form of dependency. They become dependent on the belief that their judgment is reliable. And once that happens, every new piece of information faces a hidden test. Is it true? Or does it threaten the story I tell myself about who I am? This is why self-deception is so difficult to recognize. It rarely arrives disguised as a lie. It arrives disguised as reason. The mind does not usually say, "I want to believe this." The mind says, "The evidence clearly supports this." Those two statements can feel identical. But they are not. And that difference may be one of the most important psychological insights hidden beneath the surface of great literature. Imagine a courtroom. The verdict has already been decided. The judge believes the trial is merely a formality. Witnesses are called. Evidence is presented. Arguments are heard. But none of it truly matters. Because the conclusion came first. The investigation came later. That is another memory fragment worth holding on to, a verdict announced before the trial begins. The unsettling possibility is that many of our strongest opinions work exactly this way. Not because we are dishonest, but because we are human. And this is where Elizabeth's significance expands beyond her own world. What appears to be a personal flaw is actually a universal cognitive pattern. The same mechanism shapes political arguments. It shapes social media debates. It shapes family conflicts. It shapes careers, relationships, and reputations. People rarely search for truth in a neutral way. They search for confirmation. The scale suddenly shifts. What looked like the story of one intelligent woman becomes a study of how entire societies can mistake certainty for wisdom. And that raises another mystery. If intelligence can be recruited into defending our existing beliefs, then intelligence itself cannot be the final safeguard against self-deception. Something else is required. Something rarer. Something far less celebrated. Not the ability to think, but the ability to question the thinker. And that brings us closer to the real paradox at the center of Elizabeth's journey. Because the greatest obstacle to truth may not be prejudice. It may be the invisible pride that convinces us we have already escaped it. But if that is true, then an even more unsettling question emerges. How can someone recognize a blind spot when the blind spot is the very thing doing the looking? But what happens when the mind becomes so confident in its own judgment that it stops distinguishing between evidence and interpretation? That is where the real crisis begins. Not when a person makes a mistake. Not when a person reaches the wrong conclusion. The crisis begins when the process itself becomes invisible. Because the most dangerous intellectual trap is not believing something false. It is forgetting that you might be wrong. Elizabeth represents a fascinating contradiction. She is not a passive observer trapped by the limitations of her world. She is active, analytical, and deeply engaged with the people around her. Her strength comes from her ability to interpret motives. She constantly reads intentions, evaluates character, and forms conclusions. But there is a hidden cost to becoming skilled at reading others. Eventually, you begin to trust your reading more than reality itself. This is the paradox. The variability that creates insight can also create distortion. The very strength that helps someone avoid manipulation can become the mechanism through which they manipulate themselves. And this pattern extends far beyond literature. Throughout history, societies have often fallen into the same trap. The more successful a system becomes, the more convinced it becomes that its assumptions are correct. The more powerful an institution becomes, the less willing it becomes to question its foundations. The more certain a civilization becomes about its worldview, the more vulnerable it becomes to ideas it never expected. The scale has shifted. What appeared to be a personal psychological flaw now begins to resemble a universal pattern of human behavior. A pattern repeated by individuals, organizations, and entire cultures. There is another memory fragment worth carrying forward. Imagine a lighthouse standing on a rocky coast. Its purpose is to help ships avoid danger. But imagine the lighthouse slowly turning inward, shining its beam only upon itself. The light remains bright. The structure remains impressive. Yet its purpose has been lost. This is what happens when intelligence becomes self-referential. The goal quietly changes. The search for truth becomes the defense of certainty. And once certainty becomes the goal, contradictory evidence no longer functions as information. It becomes a threat. Notice how subtle this transformation is. The person still appears rational. The arguments still sound logical. The conclusion still seems supported by evidence. Everything looks the same from the outside. But internally, something fundamental has changed. The mind is no longer asking, "What is true?" It is asking, "How can I protect what I already believe?" This is why self-deception is so difficult to detect. It often wears the costume of intelligence. In fact, some of the most convincing mistakes in history were made by highly intelligent people. Not because they lacked reasoning ability, but because they trusted that ability too much. And this leads us toward an even deeper contradiction hidden beneath Elizabeth's role. Perhaps the opposite of ignorance is not intelligence. Perhaps the opposite of ignorance is humility. Because humility allows a person to remain unfinished, to remain open, to remain capable of revising the story they tell themselves about the world. Without humility, intelligence can become a closed system, a room with no windows, a courtroom where every verdict confirms the last one, a mirror that reflects everyone except the observer. And that is where the crisis reaches its most unsettling point. The problem is no longer that people believe false things. The problem is that they become emotionally attached to being the kind of person who cannot be fooled. Which raises a mystery far more troubling than any simple error in judgment. If certainty itself can become an identity, then what happens when reality demands that identity be shattered? And more importantly, why do some people grow when that moment arrives, while others spend the rest of their lives defending an illusion? What if the real transformation does not begin when a person discovers a new truth, but when they become capable of surviving the collapse of an old one? That question brings us to the deeper revelation hidden beneath everything we have explored so far. The central issue was never whether judgment can fail. Human judgment fails constantly. The deeper issue is what happens when reality confronts an identity built upon being right. Because the most painful discoveries are rarely factual. They are personal. They force a person to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the mistake was not in what I saw, but in the way I saw. This is where Elizabeth becomes more than an intelligent observer trapped by certainty. She becomes a symbol of a rare psychological threshold. The threshold between perception and self-awareness. Most people assume wisdom comes from gathering knowledge. But great literature repeatedly suggests something different. Wisdom often begins with subtraction. Not acquiring a new lens, but realizing the old lens was distorting everything. Imagine carrying a map for years. The map has guided every decision, every conclusion, every judgment. Then one day you discover the map was never accurate. The crisis is not that the map was wrong. The crisis is that you built your identity around trusting it. That image functions as another memory fragment. A traveler standing at a crossroads holding a beautifully detailed map that no longer matches the landscape. Suddenly the problem is no longer navigation. The problem is trust. Trust in oneself. Trust in perception. Trust in the stories that organize reality. This is the revelation emerging beneath Elizabeth's role. Her significance does not come from being exceptionally perceptive. It comes from representing the moment when perception itself becomes the object of examination. The observer finally turns toward the observer. And that changes everything. Because once a person begins questioning the process through which conclusions are formed, an entirely different kind of intelligence emerges. Not intelligence measured by speed. Not intelligence measured by cleverness. Not intelligence measured by the ability to win arguments. A deeper form. The ability to revise oneself. Notice how radical this idea becomes when expanded beyond an individual character. Entire institutions struggle with the same challenge. Entire societies struggle with the same challenge. The greatest failures of systems often begin with the inability to update assumptions that once appeared unquestionably true. The pattern repeats at every scale. Individual minds, communities, cultures, civilizations. A successful framework becomes an unquestioned framework. An unquestioned framework becomes a fragile framework. And fragility remains invisible until reality applies pressure. The consequence is profound. A person who cannot revise perception becomes trapped inside yesterday's understanding. A society that cannot revise perception becomes trapped inside yesterday's truths. Suddenly, this is no longer a story about intelligence. It is a story about adaptation. About whether human beings possess the courage to outgrow the versions of themselves that once felt certain. And hidden inside that question is a symbol that runs quietly through the entire discussion. Not a mirror. Not a courtroom. Not a map. A doorway. Because every collapse of certainty is also an invitation. Every shattered assumption creates a threshold between who we were and who we might become. Yet one mystery remains unresolved. If growth requires the dismantling of certainty, then why do some people experience that dismantling as liberation, while others experience it as a threat? And perhaps even more importantly, what if the greatest form of pride is not believing you are right, but believing there is nothing left about yourself that still needs to be questioned? So what is the deepest truth hidden beneath all of this? What is the insight that sits beneath the psychology, beneath the symbols, beneath the questions of perception and certainty? The answer is surprisingly simple, and that simplicity is exactly why it is so easy to miss. The central tragedy is not that human beings fail to see reality clearly. The central tragedy is that human beings often mistake self-awareness for self-knowledge. At first glance, those two things appear identical. They are not. Self-knowledge is knowing facts about yourself, your preferences, your values, your strengths, your weaknesses. Self-awareness is something much rarer. It is the ability to observe the process through which those facts are constructed. One describes the contents of the mind. The other examines the machinery. And this is the revelation that transforms the entire meaning of Elizabeth's role. She is not ultimately a symbol of intelligence. She is a symbol of the gap between intelligence and self-awareness. That gap is where illusion survives. Most readers assume the great danger in human life is ignorance. But Jane Austen points towards something far more subtle. The danger is unconscious certainty. The danger is reaching a point where intelligence becomes so integrated into identity that questioning oneself begins to feel like self-destruction. This is why genuine growth feels uncomfortable. It requires something far more difficult than learning. It requires surrender. Not surrender to another person. Not surrender to authority. Surrender to the possibility that the version of reality we constructed may be incomplete. Imagine a magnificent castle built over decades. Every stone carefully placed. Every wall reinforcing the structure. Then imagine discovering that the foundation beneath it contains a flaw. The greatest challenge is not repairing the flaw. The greatest challenge is accepting that the flaw exists at all. That castle is another memory fragment. Not because it represents weakness. Because it represents attachment. Human beings become attached to their interpretations in the same way they become attached to possessions, identities, and beliefs. The larger the structure becomes, the harder it is to renovate. Suddenly the conflict inside Elizabeth begins to resemble a conflict that exists everywhere. In politics. In institutions. In academic systems. In families. In cultures. Entire groups can become attached to narratives that once provided stability. Over time, those narratives stop being tools for understanding reality and become barriers against it. The pattern repeats endlessly. What begins as insight becomes doctrine. What begins as doctrine becomes identity. What begins as identity becomes resistance to change. The scale has expanded again. This is no longer a literary observation. It is a principle of human nature. The individuals who continue growing throughout life are not necessarily the most intelligent. They are often the people most willing to revise themselves. They understand something that many others never learn. The purpose of perception is not validation. The purpose of perception is correction. The mind was never designed to arrive at certainty and remain there forever. It was designed to continuously update itself in response to reality. And perhaps that is the deepest meaning hidden beneath the entire discussion. Wisdom is not the absence of error. Wisdom is the willingness to let reality win the argument. Even when the argument is against us. Even when it threatens our pride. Even when it dismantles an identity we spent years constructing. The consequence of this realization reaches far beyond one character, one novel, or one historical moment. Because if the greatest obstacle to truth is not ignorance but attachment to our own perception, then every person faces the same challenge. Not whether they can think clearly, but whether they can release a belief that once made them feel certain. And if that is the true measure of wisdom, then a much larger question emerges. What becomes of a person, a society, or a civilization when it loses the ability to revise the stories it tells itself about reality? The most important consequences are often invisible. They do not appear as dramatic events. They appear as permanent changes in the way a person sees the world. And that is where the legacy of this entire struggle begins. Once someone recognizes that perception itself can become a source of distortion, there is no easy return to innocence. The old confidence disappears. The assumption of objectivity weakens. A new burden emerges. The burden of uncertainty. At first, that sounds like a loss. After all, certainty feels comforting. Certainty creates stability. Certainty simplifies decisions. But there is another side to the story. The collapse of false certainty creates space for something stronger. Not confidence in conclusions, but confidence in adaptation. Not faith in a single interpretation, but faith in the ability to keep learning. This is the lasting consequence of the transformation we have been examining. The change is not simply intellectual. It is existential. A person who understands the limitations of perception begins moving through the world differently. They listen differently. Judge differently. Disagree differently. They become less interested in proving themselves correct and more interested in understanding what they may be missing. That shift may appear small. In reality, it changes everything. Consider another memory fragment. A traveler once carried a map that no longer matched the landscape. Now imagine that same traveler walking forward without demanding perfect certainty about every turn. The map is no longer treated as reality itself. It becomes a tool. Useful, but incomplete. That distinction represents a profound psychological evolution. The same principle applies far beyond the individual. Communities develop collective maps. Institutions develop collective maps. Entire cultures develop collective maps. These maps help people navigate complexity. They create order. They provide meaning. Yet every map eventually becomes outdated. Every framework eventually encounters realities it was never designed to explain. The consequence of forgetting this truth can be enormous. History is filled with examples of systems that became prisoners of their own assumptions. Organizations that could not adapt. Traditions that could not evolve. Ideas that could not survive contact with changing circumstances. The pattern is remarkably consistent. What once created success eventually becomes the obstacle to future growth. The scale has expanded again. We are no longer discussing one character, one relationship, or even one novel. We are discussing a recurring feature of human civilization. The inability to update perception when reality changes. This may be why the themes explored here continue to resonate centuries later. Technologies change. Economies change. Political systems change. Human psychology changes far more slowly. The same forces remain active beneath the surface. Attachment. Identity. Interpretation. Certainty. Self-protection. The names evolve. The mechanisms remain. And perhaps that is the true legacy left behind by stories like this. Not answers. Warnings. Warnings about what happens when intelligence becomes detached from humility. Warnings about what happens when perception stops evolving. Warnings about the hidden cost of becoming emotionally invested in being right. Another memory fragment emerges here. A lighthouse that once illuminated the horizon begins shining only upon itself. The structure remains standing. The light remains bright. Yet its purpose quietly disappears. The tragedy is not darkness. The tragedy is misdirected illumination. And that insight leaves us with a difficult reflection. The greatest threats to understanding may not come from ignorance, deception, or even malice. They may come from minds that have become too certain of their own clarity. Which leads to a final unresolved paradox. If growth requires uncertainty, and uncertainty often feels uncomfortable, why are human beings so naturally drawn towards certainty in the first place? And could the very desire for psychological security be the force that repeatedly pulls us away from truth, generation after generation? Perhaps the most enduring works of literature survive not because they provide answers, but because they quietly change the questions we ask ourselves. Long after the details fade, long after the setting feels distant, something remains. A feeling. A hesitation. A moment of reflection. That appears unexpectedly years later when we find ourselves standing before a difficult decision, a painful disagreement, or a certainty we have never thought to examine. That may be the deepest legacy left behind here. Not a lesson about intelligence. Not a lesson about judgment. But a lesson about the relationship between identity and truth. Throughout this journey, we have encountered a series of images. A mirror that cannot reflect the observer. A courtroom where the verdict arrives before the trial. A lighthouse that turns its light inward. A traveler carrying a map that no longer matches the landscape. A doorway standing at the edge of certainty. These are not merely symbols within a discussion. They are symbols of a recurring human experience. Every person eventually encounters a moment when reality refuses to conform to the story they have been telling themselves. Sometimes that moment arrives quietly. Sometimes it arrives all at once. Yet what matters is not the disruption itself. What matters is the response. Because the defining characteristic of a human life may not be intelligence, talent, status, or accomplishment. It may be the capacity to remain open when certainty would feel easier. This is why the character at the center of our exploration continues to matter. Not because she is unique, but because she is familiar. She represents something many people experience but rarely recognize. The uncomfortable realization that growth often begins where self-confidence reaches its limit. The realization that perception is never a finished achievement. It is an ongoing responsibility. And perhaps that idea has become even more relevant in the modern world. We live surrounded by information, opinions, algorithms, and endless opportunities for confirmation. Never before has it been easier to find evidence supporting what we already believe. Never before has it been easier to construct a reality that feels perfectly coherent from the inside. Yet the challenge remains exactly the same. The challenge is not access to knowledge. The challenge is maintaining the humility necessary to question how knowledge is being interpreted. The deeper human meaning emerges. Here. Wisdom may not be measured by how many answers a person possesses. It may be measured by the quality of the questions they continue asking after they have acquired those answers. There is something strangely beautiful about that idea. It suggests that maturity is not the elimination of uncertainty. It is learning how to live alongside uncertainty without becoming paralyzed by it. To move forward while remaining teachable. To think deeply without becoming imprisoned by thought. To develop convictions without transforming them into walls. And so the final image is not a mirror, a map, a lighthouse, or a doorway. It is a person standing at the edge of a vast horizon. Not because they have reached the end of understanding, but because they have finally realized there is no end. Every answer reveals another question. Every certainty conceals another blind spot. Every discovery expands the boundary of what remains unknown. Perhaps that is why stories like this continue to speak across centuries. They remind us that the greatest challenge is not learning how to see the world. The greatest challenge is learning how to see ourselves while we are looking at it. And if every human being is, in some way, carrying a map, defending a verdict, guarding a lighthouse, or standing before a mirror, then the question that remains is not whether we possess blind spots. The question is whether we have the courage to keep searching for them, even when they are hidden inside the very things we trust most.